Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 53rd deck and it actually is a unique deck because this actually marks the 1 year anniversary of posting a video every single week. So we have a whole year's worth of Commander's Guild decks. So if you haven't checked out any of our episodes in the past, I highly recommend you do so. I think they're pretty good, but I am a little biased, I'll be honest. And this week's deck is called the Blind Bandit. And if you haven't actually seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I do want to plug some of our social media accounts. If you are ever interested in checking out some of the updates that we post on videos, or maybe just keeping in touch with us, or we also do take suggestions for cards, so you can suggest cards to us. You can always reach out via these channels. So you can find us on Twitter, at Reddit, you can send us an email. Those are all great ways to keep in touch with us if that's something you're looking to do. And then if you're interested in supporting our content, you can use our affiliate code with TCG Player. Any clicks on that link and any cards you purchase through their website, we get a little bit of support from them. So I would appreciate that very much. And then we do also have our Patreon account where you can get some great rewards for signing up there. Any of the money does go toward trying to buy some equipment to film some in-person games, so all the support there is appreciated as well. And the rewards get you access to videos early. They get you access to some unedited videos, so you can see the gameplay with all of the players' commentary and everything that's happening at that moment, as well as the opportunity to maybe play in some games yourself. So if that is something you're interested in, please do check it out. And if none of those are your thing, you can always just like the video and subscribe. That does help out quite a bit, and I appreciate all of the support. But with all of that being said, I think it's time that we jump into our deck for the week. And in this case, we got to take a look at our random card, which was actually suggested to us by Kitchen Fink right here on YouTube. And our card this week is Blind Seer. Now, Blind Seer is 2 blue for a creature legend, 3/3, and you can pay 1 in a blue and target spell or permanent becomes the color of your choice until end of turn. So this is a super unique card. There's not a lot of color changing in Magic. They've definitely moved away from it recently. So most of the color changing cards are a little bit older. So we did have to dig a little bit to find some cards that fit with Blind Seer. But as with all of our random cards, if it does happen to be a legendary creature, we got to make that card our commander. So we are a mono blue deck this week, built completely around Blind Seer. And without wasting any more time, I figure we should probably take a look at some themes for the deck. So the first one, as you may have been able to guess by Blind Seer, we want to focus on cards that care about another card's color. So, for example, we have Blue Elemental Blast, which is 1 blue mana for an interrupt, which would be an instant now. And it says counter target red spell or destroy target red permanent. Now, this is a great card if there is red at the table, but maybe we sit down to play a game and none of our opponents are actually playing red. That is where we combine this with Blind Seer to change the color on any other permanent on the board, maybe a spell that's on the stack. We have tons of ways of shifting around cards that care about colors. So with Blind Seer, we can turn any other permanent on the board into whatever color we want, in this case, red. And then for 1 blue mana, we can destroy that permanent. So for 3 mana, we can now destroy any permanent on the board, lands included. So that can be incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. And that's not the only connection between our color changing cards. We do have quite a few in here, and most of them focus on red and green just because of the way that blue works as a color. It really tries to hate on red and green, but we do have some other color hate in here as well. So that is a major theme for our deck. Now, with all of that in our deck, with so many different cards that care about colors and so many different cards that can change a card's color, that naturally led us to have an instant and sorcery theme for this deck. We have a ton of instants and sorceries. We actually have a total of 37 instants and sorceries in this deck. So we do have some payoffs for running that many instants and sorceries, and in this case, we have something like Trail of Evidence, which is 2 and a blue for an enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, investigate. And investigating means we put a colorless clue artifact token onto the battlefield with pay 2 mana, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. Being able to investigate every single time we cast an instant or sorcery essentially means that we are drawing a card for an extra 2 mana every time we play one of our spells. So we can change the color of something, maybe counter it or destroy it, such as using Blue Elemental Blast, and then also draw a card for an extra 2 mana. So this can be incredibly useful, and we do have a ton of ways to kind of pay off our deck for casting so many instants or sorceries. And then that, of course, leads us to our final theme, which is a bit of a combination of these two. Because we have so many instants and sorceries, and we needed some payoffs for casting our instants and sorceries, that naturally led to token generators. There are a ton of token generators in Mono Blue that specifically make tokens when you cast an instant or sorcery. So Murmuring Mystic, for example, is 3 and a blue for a 1/5 human wizard that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue bird illusion creature token with flying. Now, Murmuring Mystic is not the cheapest of these. It does cost 4, and it's not the most powerful since it only makes 1/1 blue birds, but this kind of gives you an idea for what our deck is trying to do. We can make birds, we can make wizards, we can make drakes, we can make fractals and constructs and flying sharks. We have a ton of ways in this deck to make tokens. So hopefully we can, use a Blue Elemental Blast to counter or destroy a red permanent. That could be any permanent, which then makes us a clue thanks to Trail of Evidence, makes us a 1/1 bird thanks to Murmuring Mystic, and we are able to just play our normal game plan and slowly kind of snowball out of control, hopefully getting a little bit too much for our opponents to stop. So that is the general idea for this deck. These are our themes. And so with the themes out of the way, let's take a quick look at some key cards in this deck. Some cards that work incredibly well with our synergies and our cards and things that we are just trying to do. So the first of those is going to be Archmage Emeritus, which is 2 blue for a human wizard. It's a 2/2, and it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. Now, we don't really have ways to copy spells in here, so that's not going to be super relevant, but it still lets us draw a card every time we cast an instant or sorcery spell. Now, keeping in mind, we have 37 instants and sorceries. That essentially just tacks on the phrase draw a card to every single one of our cards. They all just replace themselves. That is super, super powerful, especially because, a little bit of a spoiler for the deck list, out of those 37 cards, 31 of them are instant speed cards. So we want to be able to play at instant speed for the most part and kind of surprise our opponents. Maybe we make a ton of tokens on someone's end step, and then we refill our hand because each of those instants and sorceries just replaces itself thanks to Archmage Emeritus. So Archmage Emeritus, a phenomenal card. Honestly kind of surprised it's only about $2.66. I keep expecting this card to be more money when I try to slot it into decks, so super happy that we were able to fit this in here as well. And then our second key card for this deck is Junkwinder, which is 5 blue for a 5/6 serpent, and it has affinity for tokens, so this spell costs 1 less to cast for each token you control. And whenever a token enters the battlefield under your control, tap target non-land permanent and opponent controls, and it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So, very similar to Archmage Emeritus, we want to be casting a ton of instants and sorceries, and in this deck, most of our instants and sorceries are going to be making us some tokens. And with Junkwinder, not only do we tap down our opponent's tokens, we tap them down for an entire turn cycle. They don't untap on their opponent's next untap step. So that makes Junkwinder incredibly powerful for what we're trying to do, because one turn in Commander can sometimes feel like an eternity. It's a surprisingly short amount of time, but at the same time, it can last a lot longer than you think. So Junkwinder definitely earns a spot as being a key card in this deck, especially when you start thinking about maybe we just have a ton of tokens and play this for 2 blue mana and then make some more tokens and tap down some attackers, tap down some blockers. So Junkwinder, definitely an all-star here. And then finally, the last card to talk about is going to be Douse. And Douse is 2 and a blue for an enchantment that says 1 in blue, counter target red spell, play this ability as an interrupt. So Douse allows us to counter any red spells that are cast at the table. But keep in mind, we can change the color of spells when we want to. So even if we're just combining this with Blind Seer, that's 4 mana, counter any spell. So we are able to essentially lock down the table and shut anyone down from casting something as long as we have the mana to do so. But it also allows us to have a counterspell just sitting on the table, which can lead to some interesting situations. Maybe our opponents won't want to cast spells into it, or maybe they'll try to force us to use it, or maybe it's just enough to kind of give us that 1 to 2 extra turns that we need to take over the game. So Douse does everything we want it to do. It works with our color changing, it works with our instants and sorceries, because we can hold up our mana. If nobody does anything, then we cast our instants, or we can just use the mana to counter whatever they play. So absolutely love Douse in this deck. I think it earns its spot in the key cards. And that is a good portion of this deck tech. But the next piece, for those who have been watching for a while may know, we got to take a look at some cool interactions. We want to look at some synergies in this deck and focus on a couple of card pairs that work incredibly well together. So the first of those cool interactions is going to be between Indigo Fairy and Willbreaker. So Indigo Fairy is 1 and a blue for a fairy wizard. It's a 1/1 with flying, and you can pay a blue, and target permanent becomes blue in addition to its other colors until end of turn. And if we pair that up with Willbreaker, which is 3 blue for a human wizard, 2/3, whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes the target of a spell or ability you control, gain control of that creature for as long as you control Willbreaker. So these two cards combined read, we can pay 1 blue mana and gain control of target creature. That is an incredibly powerful ability, and yeah, we have to keep Willbreaker around, but we do have ways to protect her, which we'll get into a little bit later. So Indigo Fairy and Willbreaker, if allowed to stick around, means that we can just sink most of our mana into these two, take pretty much any other creature on the board. Yeah, it doesn't gain haste, so we can't attack with it the turn that we take it, but maybe we get some blockers out of the way. We could do this at instant speed, so we can pull some attackers out of combat. If our opponents have a key creature or combo piece on board, we can just steal it. So these two are incredibly powerful together, and it's nice to have that instant speed, 1 mana, steal a creature. You don't really see that too often. So that is our first cool interaction. And then our second cool interaction is going to be between Metallurgic Summonings and High Tide. And at first glance, these two don't look like they work super well together, but give me just a minute, I will explain everything. So first up though, we have Metallurgic Summonings, which is 3 blue for an enchantment, and it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create an XX colorless construct artifact creature token, where X is that spell's mana value. So for example, if we cast High Tide, it costs 1, so we would make a 1/1 construct. And it also says 3 blue, exile Metallurgic Summonings, return all instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand, but activate only if you control 6 or more artifacts, which hopefully we will, because we'll be making constructs with the Metallurgic Summonings. And then, if we combine that up with High Tide, which is 1 blue for an instant, that says until end of turn, all islands produce an additional blue when tapped for mana. Now, really quickly, it is important to note that this says all islands, not just islands we control. So if our opponents are playing blue, this does affect them as well. So that is something to be aware of. But this lets all of our islands make an additional blue mana. So all of our islands are tapping for 2 mana, which doesn't sound incredibly powerful. But keep in mind, we can cast High Tide with Metallurgic Summonings on board, make the little 1/1, and then hopefully we have enough of our artifacts and constructs in play that we could actually use Metallurgic Summoning's ability, exile it, return all instants and sorceries from our graveyard to our hand, which would include the High Tide we just cast. And if you cast High Tide multiple times, the ability actually stacks. So if we cast High Tide for the second time in one turn, all of our islands produce an additional 2 blue mana when tapped for mana. That means all of our islands are making 3 mana. At that point, we should be able to cast pretty much all of the instant and sorcery cards that we just returned from our graveyard to our hand. So High Tide is mainly the enabler, and then Metallurgic Summonings is kind of the finisher in this deck. Being able to put these two together means that we can make an absurd amount of mana and cast pretty much every spell that we've already cast up to this point in the game, and hopefully at that point, we'll find some way to win if we don't have other token generators on board already. So that is, for the most part, the deck itself. The only last major piece of the deck tech is to take a look at the price of the deck, because this is a budget show after all. And our price for this week came in at $87.46, and a very large portion of that actually comes from Veilstone Amulet. So Veilstone Amulet is 3 mana for an artifact that says whenever you play a spell, creatures you control can't be the targets of spells or abilities your opponents control this turn. So we are able to have this on board, and if anyone tries to maybe bounce any of our creatures or kill any of our creatures or take any of our creatures or do, well, anything to our creatures, all we have to do is cast a spell, and we give our entire board hexproof until the end of turn. That is incredibly powerful when, again, we have 31 instant speed spells in this deck. So all we've got to do is hold up a couple mana, maybe hold up a couple spells, and it's almost impossible for our opponents to wipe our board or remove anything unless they use an actual board wipe that destroys all creatures. So yeah, Veilstone Amulet is incredibly expensive, $11.57, but I do think it's worth it in this deck. However, if you're not looking to spring the extra money, cutting this out of the deck pulls it pretty much below $80. You're looking at about $76, which is much more manageable. And then that can easily be replaced by another instant or sorcery. There are some color-changing spells we didn't include as well, so there are some slight upgrades that could be made. And if you are looking for financial upgrades, you're looking to increase the price of this deck, I do have 2 suggestions for some out-of-budget upgrades for this particular deck. The first of which is Whim of Volrath, which is a 1 mana instant. It has buyback 2, so you may pay an additional 2 when you play this spell. If you do, you put it into your hand instead of your graveyard when it resolves. And it says change the text of target permanent by replacing all instances of 1 color word or basic land type with another until end of turn. So again, we can turn a red permanent into a blue permanent, or we can basically turn anything that cares about red permanents into caring about any other permanent. This could also be used on lands, but the importance here is that it's a 1 mana instant speed spell with buyback that does what our deck is trying to do. Now, unfortunately, this is a $27 card, and I will be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure why this is $27. I don't see a lot of decks that probably want to run this, so I'm sure there's something out there that I'm missing, but it is a pretty cool card, and if you happen to have one laying around, or you're just interested in finding the exact pieces this deck wants, then this could be a very good upgrade. And then our second out-of-budget upgrade, if you are interested in Blind Seer or have looked into color changing cards in the past, you may actually know about this card already, and that is Painter's Servant. Painter's Servant is 2 generic mana for an artifact creature Scarecrow. It's a 1/3, and when it comes into play, you choose a color. All cards that aren't in play, spells, and permanents are the chosen color in addition to their other colors. So we can make every single card in the game, whether it's in someone's hand, someone's deck, someone's graveyard, anywhere, we can make them all the same color, which is incredibly important because the vast majority of our cards care about hating out green or red cards. So if we specifically name red, that automatically turns almost all of our color hate on for any deck, even if it's not running red. So Painter's Servant is incredibly powerful, and if you're looking for a one-shot kill, you could of course combine this with Grind Clock as well, but we're not really looking to do that in this. We really just want it for the color changing, which is why it's very unfortunate that it is $66, but being part of a 2-card infinite combo, it kind of could be expected. So those are our out-of-budget upgrades. And then the last thing that we've got to do, the actual last thing we've got to do this time, is take a look at how this deck performs in a game. So we are going to jump into a game of Commander with 3 opponents this week. We have Bilal playing his Alayla Artful Provocateur deck. We have Jason playing his Olivia Crimson Bride deck. And we have Shawn playing his Gitrog Monster deck. So Bilal's Alayla deck is a 100% creatureless deck. He doesn't play any creatures in it. It's all artifacts and instants, sorceries, enchantments. And he wants to make a ton of fairies, make them as big as possible, and just start swinging at his opponents and keep refilling his board by just casting more and more spells. So I do think that we've got to get some of our token generators online to try to compete with that. But if we can do that, then there's a good chance that we'll be able to maybe stick it out with the fairies. Next up, we have Jason, and his Olivia Crimson Bride deck is not a vampire deck like Lena's is whenever she shows up on the channel. It's actually more of a reanimator deck. So he wants to play a ton of massive creatures, throw them into the graveyard early, get Olivia on board, start swinging, and just keep recurring these creatures and keep doing tons of damage, pulling them in and out of graveyards, and basically doing things that he shouldn't be able to do with the amount of mana that he has. So I'm very interested to see how this deck runs. I think it'll be kind of cool to see how it compares to Lena's, who, like I said, has been on the channel before. So that should be a pretty good deck. And then last but not least, we have Shawn and his Gitrog Monster deck. I will say, I think out of all of the decks at this table, the Gitrog Monster is the one that I am the most afraid of. Shawn's Gitrog Monster is incredibly powerful. He wants to use a lot of land synergies to kind of cycle lands in and out of his graveyard, draw a ton of cards, and then find ways to use that value to just run his opponents over. So I'm worried that he might be able to get off an engine and kind of start rolling, and we might not be able to do anything about it. But hopefully we'll be able to do something with our tokens to kind of put a stop to that if we need to. So these are our opponents for the week. I'm very excited for this game, and I hope you all enjoy it, and I'll talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by myself, Jason, and then Shawn. On Bilal's first turn, he plays an Orzhov Guildgate. I play an island. Jason plays a Foreboding Ruins. Shawn plays an Ancient Tomb and then casts Golgari's Signet, taking 2 damage for tapping the Ancient Tomb. Bilal plays a Watery Grave untapped, paying 2 life, and then casts Arcane Signet, and at the end of his turn, I cycle a Lonely Sandbar. On my turn, I play an island and pass. Jason plays a Swamp and casts a Rakdos Signet. Shawn plays a forest and casts Birds of Paradise and passes. Bilal plays a plains and casts his commander, Alayla Artful Provocateur, allowing him to create a fairy token whenever he casts an artifact or enchantment. I play a Castle Vantress and then cast Trail of Evidence, making a clue token whenever I cast an instant or sorcery. Jason casts a Mind Stone and then cast Cathartic Reunion, discarding Archon of Cruelty and Flayer of the Hatebound to draw 3 cards, and then he plays a Swamp. Shawn casts his commander, the Gitrog monster, which forces him to sacrifice a land in his upkeep, but lets him play 2 lands a turn and draw a card when a land goes to his graveyard. He then plays a Bloodstained Mire, sacrificing it to search his library and put an Overgrown Tomb into play tapped, and also draws a card with Gitrog. He then plays Llanowar Wastes, casts Sol Ring, and passes. Bilal plays an island and casts Favorable Winds, making a fairy, giving all his flying creatures +1/+1, and casts Phyrexian Arena, drawing a card and losing a life on his upkeep, making yet another fairy. He then moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 3 with a Layla, gaining 3 life thanks to lifelink. I play an island, and then cast Talrand Sky Summoner, making a 2/2 Drake token whenever I cast an instant or sorcery. Jason plays a Gyre Reach Sanitarium, and then casts his commander Olivia Crimson Bride. Since she has haste, he goes to combat and attacks Shawn for 3, triggering his commander and returning Archon of Cruelty to play, attacking me for 6. When the Archon enters, it also triggers, forcing Shawn to sacrifice a creature, discard a card, and lose 3 life, while Jason draws a card and gains 3 life. This winds up killing the Birds of Paradise and putting a Worm Harvest into Shawn's graveyard. In Shawn's upkeep, he sacrifices a forest for Gitrog, and then draws a card, before casting Ramunap Excavator, which allows him to play lands from his graveyard. After that, he plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, and replays Bloodstained Mire from his graveyard, sacrificing it to search his library and put a Swamp into play. After that, he casts Necropotence, forcing himself to skip his draw step and exile any cards he discards, but it also allows him to pay a life to exile a card face down, and then put it into his hand at his next end step. He immediately pays 4 life, exiling 4 cards, putting them to his hand at the end of turn, and then moves to combat, attacking Jason for 6 with Gitrog Monster. In Bilal's upkeep, he draws a card and loses a life thanks to Phyrexian Arena, and then he plays a Plains and casts Rest in Peace, making another fairy and exiling all graveyards. After that, he casts a Legion's Landing, making another fairy token and a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. He moves to combat, attacking Jason for 6 and Shawn for 3 with a Layla, gaining 3 life when it does damage, and transforming his Legion's Landing. I play a Temple of the False God, and cast Solve the Equation, searching my library for an instant or sorcery and putting it to hand. This has me putting Aetherize into my hand, making a 2/2 Drake, and also making a Clue token. Jason plays a Swamp, and then attacks me for 3 with Olivia, but has no targets for her trigger, and also attacks Shawn for 6 with the Archon, doing 3 damage to Bilal, making him discard a card and sacrifice a creature, in this case, the Vampire, while Jason gains 3 life and draws a card. In his second main phase, he casts Demon of Loathing, which forces an opponent to sacrifice a creature when it deals combat damage. In Shawn's upkeep, he sacrifices a Swamp to Gitrog, but can't draw a card thanks to Rest in Peace. He then casts Wishclaw Talisman and activates Wishclaw Talisman, removing a counter from it and giving it to me so that he can search his library for a card and put it into his hand. This then lets him cast Krosan Grip, destroying the Rest in Peace. After that, he plays a Fabled Passage, sacrificing it to search his library for a forest and put it into play, and he's then able to repeat that process for a Swamp, since he can replay it from his graveyard, drawing 2 cards with Gitrog Monster. Then he casts a Sylvan Library, and at the end of turn, Bilal activates Adanto the First Fort to make a 1/1 vampire token. In Bilal's upkeep, he draws a card and loses a life thanks to the Phyrexian Arena, and he moves straight to combat, attacking Shawn for 12 with his fairies. Before the damage, however, I cast Consign to Dream to put a Layla back into Bilal's hand, making a Drake and a Clue token. This reduces the damage that Shawn takes to only 8, keeping him in the game. Then, in Bilal's second main phase, he casts Time Wipe, destroying all creatures. On my turn, I play an island, and then activate the Witchclaw Talisman, searching my library for a card, putting it to hand, and returning the talisman to Shawn's control. After that, I cast a Docent of Perfection, which creates a 1/1 wizard token whenever I cast an instant or sorcery spell. Jason plays a swamp and recasts his commander Olivia Crimson Bride. He attacks Bilal for 3 with Olivia, triggering her and returning Demon of Loathing to play, attacking me. However, before the damage, I cast Pongify to destroy Olivia, which then exiles the demon, and I make a wizard and a clue token, while Jason makes a 3/3 ape token. Shawn casts a Dread Return to put the Gitrog monster into play from his graveyard, and then plays a forest, and casts Eternal Witness, returning Ramunap Excavator from the graveyard to his hand. Once that resolves, he plays a Field of Ruin as his second land drop for the turn, and then recasts the Ramunap Excavator. Bilal draws a card and loses a life in his upkeep, and then plays a Drowned Catacomb and recasts his commander Alayla. He follows that up by casting Smothering Tithe and making a treasure token whenever an opponent draws a card unless they pay 2. This also triggers Alayla, making a fairy token. When I draw for turn, I don't pay for Smothering Tithe, so Bilal makes a treasure. I then cast a Metallurgic Summoning, which makes an XX construct every time I cast an instant or sorcery, where X is that spell's mana value. When Jason draws for his turn, he also doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, letting Bilal make another treasure. He then casts a Talisman of Indulgence, and activates Gaia Reach Sanitarium, making each player draw a card and then discard a card. This also results in Bilal making 4 more treasures, since Shawn discards a land and draws an additional card thanks to his commander. Jason follows that up with a Goblin Bombardment, allowing him to sacrifice a creature to do 1 damage to any target, and then casts Cathartic Pyre, discarding 2 cards, drawing 2 cards, and letting Bilal make 2 more treasures. In Shawn's upkeep, he sacrifices the Ancient Tomb to draw a card with Gitrog, not paying for the tithe, so Bilal makes another treasure. He then activates Witchclaw Talisman, removing the final counter, giving it to Jason, and then searching his library for a card and putting it to hand. This lets him cast Underrealm Lich, and allows him to look at the top 3 cards of his library every time he draws a card, putting 1 to hand and the other 2 into his graveyard. With that, he plays Fabled Passage and sacrifices it twice, putting himself into a loop with the Lich and Gitrog monster, and allowing himself to dig through his entire deck, because he'll repeat this process whenever land goes to the graveyard, which he can almost assuredly do every time he draws a card. Eventually, he also casts Scourge Familiar, which lets him discard a card to make a black mana. This, combined with his combo, and Kozilek Butcher of Truth, which shuffles his graveyard back into his library when it goes to the graveyard, lets him repeat the process an infinite number of times, making an infinite amount of black mana, which he eventually pours into an Exsanguinate to drain each opponent out, winning Shawn the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Shawn definitely got off to a massively fast start there. The Ancient Tomb into a Signet on turn 1, followed up by a Mana Dork on turn 2, led to some crazy powerful plays. And looking back on it, yeah, I probably shouldn't have saved him from Bilal that turn that I did, considering he pretty much won immediately after. But I didn't know that at the time, so it felt like I would get a shot at the Witchclaw Talisman, maybe get to do a little something else, but wasn't to be this time. So Shawn's deck, very powerful. I think that after that, Bilal and Jason's deck both showed quite a bit of power in their own right. Jason able to recur several very large threats very early on. Dropping that Archon that was able to swing for multiple turns was pretty impressive. And then Bilal, even though he had no creatures, easily had the biggest board out of everybody there, which is pretty impressive considering they all came from Alayla. And I think overall our deck didn't perform poorly, but I don't think it did quite as well as I was hoping. We couldn't get our token generators online. Once we got a couple, we kind of got board wiped out of it, and we weren't really given a chance to rebuild. So I think that this deck can do very powerful things, but I don't think we really got the chance to shine in this game. But maybe we'll try this deck later on down the road. Personally, I'm not a big mono blue person, so I struggle a lot when it comes to mono blue, much more of a Boros player myself. So if you have any suggestions for this deck, or honestly just for future mono blue strategies, please do let me know, because I would always be interested in hearing those. And then, of course, if you have any suggestions for cards to build around, they don't always have to be legendary creatures. I know we have done quite a few legends recently, but they could be any card that you might just want us to build around. So that is our deck for the week. I hope you all enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed the deck tech, the gameplay, and everything else. So other than that, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.